The harbor at Moth's End had always smelled of diesel and rotting kelp, even in winter when the wind came hard off the Atlantic and should have cleared the air. Thomas Merrick noticed this the morning he arrived, stepping out of his rust-spotted sedan with a canvas duffel that held everything he'd thought worth keeping after the divorce. The town itself consisted of maybe 200 souls, scattered across weatherboard houses that leaned into the prevailing winds like penitents at prayer. There was a general store, a post office that doubled as a tackle shop, and a pier where 4 fishing vessels bobbed in the gray water like broken teeth. The Asterisk Magdalene was the largest of them, a 60-foot longliner with a blue hull gone pale from salt exposure and a wheelhouse that sat slightly off-center, as though the whole structure had settled unevenly over the decades. Thomas had answered an advertisement in a marine employment newsletter, one of those sparse listings that offered deck work with room and board, no experience necessary. The pay was surprisingly generous, enough that he'd wondered briefly why they couldn't fill the position locally. But desperation has its own logic, and Thomas had been desperate enough not to ask too many questions during the phone interview. Captain Raymond Goss met him at the pier, a man of perhaps 60 with hands like cured leather and eyes the color of shallow water. He moved with the careful economy of someone whose joints had begun to ache in predictable places, and when he shook Thomas's hand, his grip was dry and firm, and lasted a moment longer than comfortable. He asked no questions about Thomas's past, showed no interest in why a man with a college degree would want to spend months hauling cod and pollock from the North Atlantic. Instead, he simply nodded toward the gangplank and told Thomas to stow his gear in the forward cabin, then meet him in the wheelhouse in 20 minutes. The crew quarters smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke layered over something else, something organic and faintly sweet that Thomas couldn't identify. 2 narrow bunks occupied the space, along with a corner cabinet and a porthole thick with salt residue. The previous occupant had left nothing behind except a smell and a series of scratches on the bulkhead beside the starboard bunk, thin parallel lines carved into the painted metal, as though someone had dragged their fingernails across the surface repeatedly over time. Thomas ran his fingers across them, feeling the rough edges, counting 19 distinct marks before stopping himself and wondering why he'd bothered to count at all. They departed before noon, the engine coughing black smoke until they cleared the breakwater and headed northeast toward the fishing grounds. Besides Thomas and the captain, there were 2 other crew members. A silent, rope-thin man named Dale who worked the winch and never made eye contact, and Marcus, who handled the galley and the bait prep and spoke only when spoken to, usually in fragments that seemed to end before he'd finished his thoughts. Neither man asked Thomas anything about himself, and when he tried to make conversation during the first dinner at sea, they responded with nods and half-smiles that didn't reach their eyes, then excused themselves to their bunks though it was barely 7 in the evening. The first week passed in the exhausting rhythm of commercial fishing, lines out before dawn, hauling in the catch through the morning, processing and icing the fish in the hold, eating meals that tasted mostly of salt and fatigue, sleeping hard in the narrow bunk while the sea worked beneath them. Thomas learned the work quickly, his hands developing calluses in the expected places, his body adapting to the constant motion and the cold that worked its way through every layer of clothing. Captain Goss said little beyond necessary instructions, but he watched Thomas constantly from the wheelhouse, his pale eyes tracking every movement with an attention that felt less like supervision and more like assessment. It was Dale who first mentioned the previous hand. They'd been working together to haul up a particularly heavy section of line, their breath steaming in the pre-dawn darkness, when Dale paused and looked at Thomas with an expression that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. He said the man's name was Connor, that he'd worked the Asterisk Magdalene for almost 3 months before something happened. Dale didn't specify what that something was, and when Thomas pressed him, he simply shook his head and returned to the winch, his thin shoulders working beneath his oil-stained jacket. That night Thomas found himself staring at the scratches beside his bunk. 19 marks. If Connor had been aboard for 3 months, roughly 12 weeks, and if he'd been marking something weekly, that would be about 12 marks. But there were 19. He tried other calculations, other intervals, but none of them quite made sense. Eventually, he turned toward the bulkhead and tried to sleep, but found himself listening instead to the sounds of the ship at night. The groan of metal under stress, the slap of waves against the hull, and something else, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from deep within the vessel, below the waterline where there should have been only storage holds and bilge pumps. The fishing was unusually good. Day after day, they pulled up lines heavy with cod, more than Captain Goss had seen in years according to Marcus, who'd been working these waters for 2 decades. But there was something wrong with some of the fish. Thomas noticed it first during his second week, when he was processing the morning catch and found 3 cod whose mouths were sealed shut with what looked like scar tissue, their lips grown together in smooth, unbroken lines. The fish were still alive when they came up, their bodies thrashing, their eyes rolling in what might have been panic or might have been something that predated language. He showed them to Marcus, who took them without comment and threw them back over the side, watching as they sank into the gray water with an expression Thomas couldn't decipher. After that, he started noticing other things. Fish with extra fins growing from their bellies, translucent and webbed. Fish whose scales had grown in spiral patterns that hurt to look at too long. Once, a pollock came up with what appeared to be a human molar embedded in its gills, though when Thomas tried to examine it more closely, Marcus took the fish from his hands and disposed of it before he could be certain of what he'd seen. The tapping from below deck grew more frequent. Thomas would lie in his bunk during his off hours and track the sound as it moved along the length of the hull, a deliberate rhythm that sometimes sped up and sometimes slowed down but never quite stopped. He asked Dale about it once, describing the sound carefully, but Dale's face had gone so pale and so tight that Thomas immediately regretted the question. Dale left the galley without finishing his meal, and for the rest of that day, he worked on the opposite side of the deck, keeping the winch and the piled nets between them like a barrier. They were 3 weeks out when Captain Goss changed their heading. Thomas was in the wheelhouse when it happened, bringing the captain his evening coffee, and he saw Goss make a slight adjustment to the wheel, turning them perhaps 5 degrees to the east. It was such a small change that Thomas almost didn't mention it, but something made him ask if they were moving to different fishing grounds. The captain was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light was draining from the sky. Then he said they were going to check the deep water, just for a night or two, just to see what might be there. The ocean changed color as they moved further from the coast. The gray-green of the shallower waters gave way to something darker, a blue so deep it was almost black even in full daylight. The character of the swells changed too, becoming longer and more regular, as though they were feeling the pulse of something vast and slow beneath them. Marcus became even more withdrawn, spending his time in the galley staring at nothing, his meals growing simpler until they were eating little more than canned soup and stale bread. Dale's hands developed a tremor that made handling the winch dangerous, and twice Thomas had to step in to prevent the machinery from running wild. On their 24th night at sea, Thomas woke to find his cabin filled with a pale green luminescence. At first, he thought it was moonlight reflecting off the water, but when he looked out the porthole, he saw that the light was coming from below, from the water itself. The ocean glowed with a diffuse radiance that extended down as far as he could see, and in that light, shapes moved with ponderous grace, too large to be fish, too regular in their movements to be random. He watched them for perhaps 10 minutes, his breath fogging the glass, until the light began to fade and the shapes descended back into darkness. He found Captain Goss standing on the deck, looking down at the water. The captain didn't turn when Thomas approached, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just stood there with his hands on the railing, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been the memory of that strange light. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engine and the wind. He said the asterisk Magdalene had been fishing these waters for 40 years, that his father had captained her before him, and his uncle before that. He said there were places in the ocean where the charts meant nothing, where the depth finder showed readings that made no sense, where things lived that had learned to remain hidden except when they chose otherwise. He said every man who'd ever worked the asterisk Magdalene had been shown these things eventually, that it was part of the agreement, though he didn't specify what agreement he meant or who the parties to it were. He said Connor had seen them too, and that Connor had counted the days until he couldn't count any more, and that was why there were 19 marks on the bulkhead instead of the 12 that should have been there, because toward the end, Connor had been making multiple marks each night, trying to hold onto time as it came loose around him. Then Captain Goss turned and looked at Thomas directly for the first time since that initial handshake on the pier. And Thomas saw that the captain's eyes weren't pale because of age or genetics, but because they'd been changed by something, bleached from the inside out by whatever he'd spent decades staring into from the deck of the asterisk Magdalene. He told Thomas that the catches would continue to be good, that the money would keep coming, that a man could make a life of sorts out here if he learned not to ask certain questions and not to look too long at certain things. He said there was no shame in choosing to go back, that they'd return to Moth's End in another week, and Thomas could walk away if he wanted to, though probably he wouldn't. The next morning, Thomas found a knife in the galley and went to his cabin. He looked at the 19 marks on the bulkhead for a long time, trying to understand what Connor had been counting toward or counting down from. Then he carved a 20th mark just below the others, the blade cutting easily through the paint into the soft metal beneath. His hand was steady as he did it, and that was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. They pulled up a remarkable catch that day, cod and pollock in numbers that seemed impossible, and among them were more of the wrong fish, the changed fish, their bodies testament to time spent in water that was never meant to hold life in forms that could be recognized. Thomas processed them all without comment now, throwing the worst ones back and keeping only those that could pass for normal at the market. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and when he glanced up at the wheelhouse, he saw Captain Goss watching him with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been sadness, or might have been the simple recognition that passes between those who have seen the same unnameable things. The tapping from below deck had become constant, a rhythm so regular that Thomas sometimes found himself moving in time with it without conscious thought. At night, the green light returned, though never for very long, and he learned to close his eyes when it filled his cabin rather than looking out the porthole at what moved beneath them in the luminous darkness. They would return to Moth's End in 6 days. Thomas knew he could leave then, could take his pay and drive away from the harbor with its smell of diesel and rot. He could find other work, in other places, far from the ocean and the things that lived in its deepest trenches. But already he was calculating how quickly he could spend through his earnings, how long before necessity or something like it would bring him back to the pier where the asterisk Magdalene waited, patient as hunger, patient as the deep water, and whatever agreements had been made in the years before he was born. He carved another mark that night, and then another the night after that, not because he was counting anything in particular, but because the act of marking had become its own ritual, its own acknowledgement of time passing in a place where time worked differently than it did on land. The blade felt comfortable in his hand. The sound of metal on metal was almost musical. Above them, stars moved across the sky in their ancient patterns, indifferent as mathematics. Below them, the depths held what they had always held, patient and vast and utterly without mercy. And between these infinities, the asterisk Magdalene moved through the dark water, her engine coughing smoke into the night, her hold filling with silver bodies that would be sold and eaten and forgotten, while the men aboard her marked their time and tried not to think too carefully about what they'd agreed to in order to survive. The trail had been there for as long as anyone in Millbrook could remember, winding through the pine forest that bordered the western edge of town like a scar through green flesh. Children walked it to school when the weather was fair, cutting 15 minutes off the route along Highway 9. Joggers used it in the early mornings, their breath visible in the autumn air. Dog walkers knew every route and curve by heart. The path was as ordinary as anything could be in a town where nothing much happened, where the most exciting event of the year was the Harvest Festival in October, and the closing of the old mill had been the defining tragedy of the past 2 decades. Sarah Dietrich had lived in Millbrook for 37 years, all of them in the same cedar-sided house on Maple Street, and she had walked that trail more times than she could count. She knew the way the light filtered through the canopy at different times of day, turning from gold to amber to a deep, swimming green. She knew the spot where the creek ran close enough to hear, and the place where someone had carved initials into a birch tree sometime in the 1980s. The path was muscle memory, a groove worn so deep in her routine that she barely noticed it anymore. It was a Tuesday in late September when she first realized something had changed. The morning had been unremarkable: oatmeal for breakfast, a lukewarm shower, the drive to the county clerk's office where she had worked for 16 years. The day had passed in its usual haze of paperwork and fluorescent lighting. At 5:15, she drove home, changed into her walking shoes, and set out for her evening constitutional, the same 4-mile loop she completed 3 times a week without fail. The trailhead sat just past the abandoned gas station on Creek Road, marked by a wooden post that had weathered to silver. Sarah parked in the gravel lot, locked her car out of habit though crime in Millbrook was virtually non-existent, and started down the familiar path. The air smelled of pine sap and decomposing leaves. A light wind moved through the trees, and somewhere a crow called out in its ragged voice. She had walked perhaps a quarter mile when she noticed the first oddity. The path seemed narrower than usual, the undergrowth pressing in from both sides as if the forest had crept forward overnight. She dismissed it as a trick of perception, perhaps the result of recent rain encouraging growth, though she could not remember any rain in the past week. The compacted dirt beneath her feet felt the same, worn smooth by countless footfalls. She continued on. At the half-mile mark, where the trail should have curved left around a massive oak tree that had to be 100 years old, she found herself walking straight instead. The oak was there, she could see it, but it stood off to her right rather than directly ahead. The path no longer went around it. This struck her as deeply wrong, though she could not immediately articulate why. Trees did not move. Paths did not change their course. Yet here she stood, facing a direction that contradicted decades of memory. Sarah stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, trying to orient herself. The forest looked the same in all directions: tall pines, scattered birches, a dense carpet of needles and leaf litter on the ground. No landmarks presented themselves. The trail behind her looked identical to the trail ahead, a narrow corridor of packed earth running through green walls. She checked her phone, intending to use the GPS, but found she had no signal. This was not unusual in the deeper parts of the woods, so she pocketed the device and decided to continue forward. The path had to lead somewhere. Paths always did. Another quarter mile and she should have reached the creek. She strained her ears for the sound of running water but heard nothing except the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. The light was beginning to fade, taking on the flat, gray quality of approaching dusk. She walked faster, her heart rate increasing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The path showed no signs of ending, no features that she recognized, no indication that she was making progress toward any destination. It simply continued, unchanging and featureless, as if she were walking on a treadmill painted to look like forest floor. She walked for what felt like an hour, though her watch insisted only 20 minutes had passed. The disconnect between perceived time and measured time unsettled her more than anything else. Time was supposed to be reliable, fixed, the one constant in an increasingly uncertain experience. But her body insisted she had been walking much longer than the numbers on her wrist suggested. Her legs ached. Her throat was dry. The light continued to fade, though sunset should still be more than an hour away. When she finally stopped to rest, leaning against a pine tree that might have been any of the thousands of pine trees in the forest, she noticed that the trail behind her was gone. Not overgrown or obscured, but simply absent, as if it had never existed. She stood at the edge of a wall of vegetation so dense it seemed impenetrable, the kind of undergrowth that should have taken years to establish. The path now ran in only one direction, forward. A cold clarity settled over her then, the kind that comes when the mind finally accepts what the body has known for some time. She was not lost in any conventional sense. The forest had not confused her or led her astray. Something else was happening, something that operated outside the usual rules of geography and physics. The path was no longer taking her anywhere. It was keeping her. She had no choice but to continue walking. Standing still seemed worse somehow, an acceptance of whatever fate the path had in store for her. So she walked, and the forest remained unchanged around her, and the light continued its impossible dimming. She thought about her house on Maple Street, about the bills on her kitchen counter and the cat that would need feeding. She thought about the people who would notice her absence, her sister in Portland, her coworker Janet, the woman at the post office who knew her by name. How long would it take for someone to worry? How long before they came looking? But who would think to look here on a trail everyone knew, a path so ordinary it barely merited mention? They would search the usual places first, her home, her office, the grocery store, the pharmacy. They might eventually check the trailhead parking lot and find her car, but that would tell them nothing. The path would be there, exactly where it had always been, showing no signs of anomaly. Other people would walk it and emerge at the expected place. The path would behave for them. Only for Sarah had it changed its nature. She walked until her legs trembled and her vision blurred at the edges. She walked until she could no longer remember why she was walking or what she had expected to find. The path stretched ahead, eternal and unchanging, and she was part of it now, another element in its geometry, no more able to leave than the trees could uproot themselves and walk away. The forest had claimed her not with violence but with simple persistence, with the steady erasure of exit and destination, until only the act of walking remained. Somewhere far away, her car sat in a gravel lot growing cold in the evening air. Somewhere far away, lights were coming on in houses along Maple Street, and people were sitting down to dinner and checking their phones, and doing all the small, ordinary things that constituted a life. But Sarah was here, on a path that went nowhere and everywhere, walking in the dimming light while the forest pressed close on all sides. The last thing she noticed, before exhaustion and resignation merged into something like acceptance, was that the path was getting narrower. Not gradually but noticeably, as if the forest were slowly closing its fist around her. The space between the trees contracted with each step she took forward, and she understood with a dull, distant horror that eventually there would be no space at all. The path would close completely, and she would be part of the forest, absorbed into its mass like water into soil, and no one would ever know what happened to Sarah Dietrich, who lived on Maple Street and walked the trail 3 times a week without fail. She walked until she could not walk anymore, and then she kept walking anyway because the path demanded it, because stopping meant something worse than continuing, because the forest was patient and she was already forgotten. Behind her, the trail vanished as it had been vanishing all along. Ahead, it stretched toward a destination that did not exist. And all around, the trees stood silent, indifferent witnesses to a disappearance that was both sudden and inevitable, both impossible and entirely real. When the search party finally combed the woods 3 days later, they found the trail exactly as it had always been, well-maintained and familiar, leading from the trailhead on Creek Road to its terminus at the old highway bridge, just as it had for decades. They found no trace of Sarah Dietrich, no sign of struggle or confusion, nothing to suggest that the path had ever been anything other than what it appeared to be. The forest kept its secrets, and the trail remained, waiting patiently for the next person who would walk it with confidence and routine, never suspecting that some paths remember who walks them, and sometimes decide not to let them leave.